Almost every science student will learn that we have heat sensors
Right.
that are part of our nervous system. They become activated. They send neural impulses up from the sensor along the nerves into the brain, and therefore we feel or perceive that heat. You're saying that doesn't really explain it.
Well, I think that you can tell a nice scientific story about what happens when the stuff in the environment hits the heat sensors. It sends a story up the optic nerve, and something happens in the brain, and some neurons wiggle up there, and so on. And then you said the last step, and therefore we feel it. Now that's the interesting step. How does that happen? How do those neurons firing and wiggling away inside the brain suddenly give rise to this subjective experience of hotness, the feeling of heat? Nothing in the scientific story, it seems, tells you why that has to happen. How does the water of the brain turn into the wine of consciousness?
Right now, a very a popular subject, very interesting subject in the scientific world is consciousness studies. It's interesting that even 20, 25 or 30 years ago, this scientists did not seem to be interested in consciousness. At the most, body, mind, that's it. But consciousness studies is a big thing right now. And if you Google consciousness studies, Google hard problem of consciousness.
The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of how physical processes in the brain give rise to the subjective experience of the mind and of the world. All of this is subjective experience, and it's one of the most familiar facts in the world that we have this subjective experience. But it's also one of the most mysterious. Why is it that these physical processes in the brain should produce subjective experience? Why doesn't it go on in the dark without any consciousness at all? No one right now knows the answer to this question.
There is a central question in consciousness studies which seems to puzzle all the scientists and philosophers and linguists and psychologists and neuroscientists. So many, it's a multidisciplinary subject, consciousness studies. But there is a question that puzzles all of them. How is it that a physical system like this body, how is it like a physical system like the brain and the nervous system? Completely physical. The doctors can see it. This physical system, how does it generate a subjective experience?
When it comes to the problem of explaining why all that physical stuff should be accompanied by a subjective experience, that seems as a different kind of question. It's what some philosophers have called an explanatory gap between the physical level and the level of consciousness. 'Cause no number, 10 neurons, 100 neurons, 1,000 neurons, 1,000 billion neurons, no matter how complex, nothing in that story seems to tell you why it is that anything should ever have a subjective feeling to it.
You see, what is meant by subjective experience is when you are looking at me, right now when you're looking at this stage, you have an experience. And the neuroscientist will tell you such and such neurons are firing in your brain and giving you that experience. Now, our experience is not of neurons firing. You see colors, you hear sound, you think thoughts, you feel happy, you feel unhappy. All of these things are subjective, first-person experiences.
There's this gap between all of our theories of the brain and subjective experience, consciousness. No matter how sophisticated our theories get of how the neurons in the brain, how any physical processes interconnect, that still doesn't give us an explanation of consciousness. You could know all there is to know about the physical processes in the world, and that still wouldn't tell you what it feels like to be me, to be you, to see red, to fall in love.
How can an objective thing, how can a piece of matter like the brain generate a completely subjective first-person experience? That is something that they cannot understand at all. And they call it the hard problem of consciousness.
Take 1,000 years into the future at the same rapid growth of science, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years. Do you see, in principle, can the hard problem, as you've defined it, be subject to neuroscience analysis?
I don't think the hard problem of consciousness can be solved purely in terms of neuroscience. There's only so much that's going to explain. Because neurons and neuroscience is all about objective mechanisms that perform functions that ultimately issue in behavior. So if you want to say explain language, explain perception, explain memory, the things we do, the functions of the brain, that's just fine. But it just explains those functions, those behaviors. And that always leaves this further question. Why is that behavior, those functions, accompanied by consciousness? For that, we need an extra ingredient in the picture, I think. We need to bring in consciousness itself, on my view, as fundamental.
Here is an interesting approach to the hard problem of consciousness. It is pure consciousness itself shining on the mind which gives you these subjective experiences. It is by the light of the ātmā, of pure consciousness, the witness. I use these words synonymously. The witness, sakshi, ātmā, self. The mind has the capacity, being very fine, mind has the capacity to reflect consciousness and then use that consciousness for what? For exactly this, for seeing, for hearing, for smelling, tasting, touching, for thinking, for all our conscious experiences. This is the Vedantic perspective on the hard problem of consciousness.